Hey there, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. And let's invite to the show regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser, one of three reps from Brattleboro, who is just finishing up the primary. And I can say she won her primary. Congratulations, Emilie.
Thank you very much, Olga. Very glad to be here, if a little sunburned from a day at the polls.
Yeah, you were there turning out the vote, weren't you?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I also want to welcome to the show John Walters, journalist behind the Vermont Political Observer. Very glad you're here. And I want everyone listening or watching the video right now to give John a massive round of applause because he is currently fighting COVID and is just for us sitting upright and putting words together. So thank you, John, for being here. We really appreciate it.
Occasionally drinking Gatorade, so which is
Good job.
Not my normal wheelhouse, but it helps the throat. So anyway, it's been a rough 10 days or so, starting to feel better.
I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, COVID's no joke. I think we're starting to normalize it a little bit, but it still is a virus. It's no joke for a lot of people. It's a very long haul. Well, we are here to talk about the primary that happened this week. And, I want to start, Emilie and John, so I've been, catching up on a lot of the coverage of the primary. And I've heard a few pundits say, gee, it was kind of a ho-hum primary. Nothing very exciting happened. And I don't know, maybe I'm just being Windham County centric here. But I thought it was a very exciting primary. It felt in part exciting because it felt like we had more contested races than we've had in past primaries. I haven't gone and counted them up or done any survey, but it just felt like there was more choice. And so more conversations around things like policies and people's leadership styles and all those things felt quite exciting. But then also, this is me being Windham County centric. We had, Emilie, you were running a contested primary. Ian Goodnow and David Gartenstein ran a contested primary in Brattleboro. And we also had a rather interesting race happening in Vernon and Guilford, otherwise known as Windham 1, that I would say got a little bit down in the muck and the mire at times. So that's kind of what I'm sitting with right now. I'm wondering from your perspectives, what did this primary say? Was it different from past years? Is it pointing, come November, pointing in new directions where we might be going as a state? I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
I think so. In terms of like the primary and the visibility and excitement around the primary, I think because we had so few contested statewide primaries where people campaigned heavily, it was ho-hum in certain ways. However, between the ne'er-do-well situation in Guilford Vernon and a few contested primaries, and I think the governor a Republican interfering in the Democratic primary quite explicitly is actually a really interesting development, to say the least. And I think there's things to be said about that made it an unusual primary and exciting in that unusualness. Probably not so exciting in the results for the governor.
Now, when you talk about the governor interfering, are you referring to the text that went out throwing support behind Stuart Ledbetter, or are you referring to other things?
So there's been a long time. I mean, I think we should spend like real time on this conversation, but so for months and months and months, there have been sort of whispers and conversations about the governor getting like actively involved in recruiting centrist Dems to run, or even Republicans to run on the Democratic ticket. And, that's long been the purview of the progressives to do that kind of thing, right? So like, it's not like it's never happened in a Democratic primary before. But recruiting folks is one thing and is an interesting move in and of itself. Like, why not fix your own party buddy? But the other piece is it wasn't just a text in support of Stuart Ledbetter. The text actually went out in there were text messages in a number of different districts in support of candidates.
Thank you.
And I think the governor was taking a real chance, and I think it blew up in his face, to be honest, because the two races I know of that he sent out text messages urging support for the centrist challenger were the Chittenden Central Senate race with Stuart Ledbetter, who lost, and the two-seat district in Waterbury, where centrist Democrat named Elizabeth Brown also wound up losing. And, when the governor not only intervenes in Democratic primaries, but intervenes in a race involving the Senate President pro tem, and not one, but two House committee chairs, Tom Stevens and Teresa Wood. He already had a terrible relationship with the legislature. I mean, I can't see this. I certainly don't see it helping. And I think it was a significant overreach on his part, and also a failure of imagination on his part, because I think there are things he could do, and I've written about this, where he could influence the course of politics, but he's not doing them. He's never been good at doing that stuff. But just to send out texts and meddle in Democratic primaries, I think is a dangerous game, and it did not work. And he's probably going to be dealing with, I mean, I know we're all adults in the room and all that, and we're all trying to work for what's best for Vermont. But, when you have the governor actively trying to defeat committee chairs and the Senate president, that's kind of a big deal.
And again, would have been like just sort of normal, reasonable politics to recruit a candidate on the Republican ticket to run against those people and throw all of his weight behind that Republican candidate. That's very different than interfering in another party's primary, which, even though we have all of this, and that's sort of like an interesting part of the primaries, like we have all of this, parties are not government entities, right? They're separate from government. And yet they have a level of formality to them that the Secretary of State's office supports, right? Like, so how does it's an interesting piece of the whole puzzle.
Yeah, and I mean, the governor has absented himself from Republican Party affairs since roughly 2017, I believe. And it's on him. He's the only voice of sort of like this moderate conservatism that could provide a counterweight to the increasing Trumpism in the party ranks. And he just hasn't done it. I can kind of understand why he doesn't want to, get into, cleaning up that particular stable. But, my suggestion to him, which I make in full confidence that he will never take it, is, get some of his, contractor buddies and some of his business buddies and some of the business types who squandered thousands of dollars supporting people like Stuart Ledbetter and Elizabeth Brown and Amanda Ellis Thurber, and start a PAC. Leave the Republican Party out of it. Start a sort of a centrist, common sense leadership PAC where you recruit candidates and you help train candidates. He and his friends could easily put together, $250,000 or $500,000. He could throw his entire campaign treasury. He has about $500,000 in the bank. He's not going to need it this fall. It would be a way to start building a sort of I don't even want to say centrist, but let's say fiscally conservative or common sense sort of approach. Instead, he's talking about restoring balance to Montpelier. And, I've been following Vermont politics since 2011. And Republicans have been saying restore balance since at least 2011. And it doesn't work. It doesn't communicate. It doesn't change anyone's mind. people, for whatever reason, and we can discuss this maybe during the course of this hour, people seem perfectly happy voting for Phil Scott for governor and voting for supermajorities and Democratic supermajorities in the legislature who have an agenda of their own and have earned as much of a mandate as Phil Scott has to, pursue the agenda. So, if I were advising him, I would say, don't even bother with the Republican politics. Try to build that third way. And he's probably the only person in terms of influence and stature and appeal to people with money. He's probably the only person who could do it.
So
I only throw it out there because I know he'll never listen to a word I say.
Emilie.
I want to say more things about the governor and things I sort of like learned during this election cycle about people's perceptions of him. But I also want to talk about like the LG race and the governor's primary and other things like that. So I don't know, leave it to you, Olga, to choose whichever direction my next sentence is.
Well, before we get to some of those things, and these, what you wanted to talk about may tie into this, but this was something I wanted to ask both of you is, I think it was the last election cycle. I remember you, John, talking about, because of what's happening at the federal level, a lot of Republicans no longer felt at home in the Republican Party, and so had kind of migrated either to being independents or Democrats, and how that might shift the Democratic Party. And
Or
yet
agnostic.
in this primary, I'll just finish this thought, the Vermont GOP sent out a press release right after the primary saying, oh my gosh, the Dems are this total like far left radical, policy party. And if you want to be a centrist, if you want to be moderate, your only home is the Republican Party. So I wanted to just put that to both of you and get your thoughts.
I mean, I know the Republican had at the state representative level had very few competitive primaries with a lot of seats that are technically open, right? And I know at least down here in Windham County, the folks who are running on the Republican ticket are certainly not moderate Republicans. They tend to be deeply faith-based driven Republicans who are sort of primary issues are around abortion.
Right.
And so I don't think that's the kind of folks that whatever that GOP email was talking about. But and what I've seen in the last couple of years is the newer Republicans that have been elected and joined the state house have been much more extreme than the ones who were already there, by leaps and bounds.
Mm-hmm.
John? Yeah, there is precious little room in the Republican Party for any sort of moderateness, or anything short of being a true believer. That is definitely true in several of the county parties, including Windham County and including Windsor County and Addison County. And with very few exception, there is not a lot of room. There is no room. I mean, in Windsor County last winter, the longtime chair of the county party was kicked to the curb by the Trump loyalists in the county committee, who then sued the ex-chair and the state party itself. That's not exactly a sign of inclusiveness. To me, there has been somewhat of a home in Democratic circles for people who probably would have been Republicans 20 or 30 years ago. There are centrist Democrats, particularly in the Senate caucus. There are quite a few.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them have retired or passed on this year, but it's if you're talking about sort of like a party of true believers, it's definitely the Republican Party and not the Democratic Party.
And what I'll, in the House at least, the more centrist Republicans that I know have actually, quite a few of them have left the House in order to run in the Senate, where you have some other like fairly moderate Republicans. And so the House is going to be even further sort of left to the more extremist Republicans, if any of them, win their reelection.
Yeah.
Mhm. So, before I asked my question, you had brought up some things you wanted to talk about, Emily, and I think one of the things you said was some of the things you've heard and people's perceptions of Phil Scott, but also what you've kind of learned during this last primary. Um, I would love to hear more about that.
So specifically some of the conversations I had with people during this primary about the governor.
Mhm.
I don't think we have time to talk about all the things I learned during this primary. But about the governor, because I think other times that I've knocked on doors and campaigned in the past, I don't think I was ready to be as like, I felt like I could just sort of ignore talking about the governor before.
Hmm.
And it's actually at this point impossible to talk about getting anything done legislatively without talking about the fact that he's just like not implementing laws a lot of the time that we have, passed into law. Like the administrative apparatus has been broken under him. So like it came up more this time around. And what I heard really over and over again was less like he's a nice guy or like it's so nice how he walks the middle ground or like we need balance, right? Because like it is Brattleboro and I was reelected and like, and Brattleboro's, like Brattleboro votes for him too.
Mhm.
It was to a T, people talking about hearing his voice during COVID and how soothing it was. And like, I would go deeper on it with people because it wasn't, and then I became fascinated. So I was like getting a little, like, it became a psychology question more than even like me campaigning because, well, whatever. I talked
That
to people
would be a
about
very fascinating thing to
yeah,
hear.
I mean, I
Yes.
talk to people about their flowers too. So like, I want to be clear, like, I'm not a very, efficient door knocker. So what people said, it was really like it's less about he handled the pandemic so responsibly, which is what I sort of heard before, but I'd never really gone deeper on it with people. And it was really like people still have like a bodily, emotional, somatic response to him, his name, and his voice because he was the trusted thing in their life during the scariest times they've ever lived through. And it
Fair
is like
enough.
a fully like ingrained in people's synapses thing, totally separate. And like, politics is not very logical and rational in the best of times, but like this is really like those moments hardwired something in people related to him personally, having nothing to do with what he stands for, his party, whoever he's going to sort of like make his next anointed one. Like, I think that's why he is sort of like stands apart. And it's not because of something fantastic he has done. It was really, really interesting. And it happened enough times that I don't feel like I'm just making things up on the radio.
Mhm. That's fascinating. That's really fascinating. And it's fascinating. I mean, John right now is dealing with COVID, so COVID has certainly not gone away. But perhaps the dark times of COVID, hopefully, knock on wood, have gone away. Um, so it's interesting that they're still hanging on this many years later.
And again, like it was not like a logical, rational conversation. It was really like people just sort of like wired, connected, really like, imprinted, I
Mhm.
think, like ducks and whatever, like
Yeah.
it was pretty incredible.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. Thank you, Emily. John, do you have any response to that? Any thoughts?
It's a really good observation. It does help explain the phenomenon of why the same group of people keep voting for all these crazy Democrats and for Phil Scott at the same time, which seems to set up a sort of an institutional gridlock that would be in nobody's interest. But I can understand why people would be comforted by the familiar and those dulcet tones, especially when you got to hear Phil Scott alongside then President Trump during the darkest days of COVID, talking about injecting bleach and shining lights up people's butts. Um, Phil Scott was a voice of calm, if nothing else, and so if that has made him a, I don't know, a hero for life or for however long he decides to stick around, then well, there he is.
Mhm.
I think it does set up a really difficult dynamic in which we have seen in the last 2 years with all the vetoes and all the veto overrides, where we really do have deeply divided government, and we do face a number of big problems that are going to require some measure of coming together in consensus to address. Whether it's homelessness, opioids, housing, workforce, K-12 education, higher education. There are a whole lot of issues. Healthcare costs. We just saw the Green Mountain Care Board this week approve another round of double-digit increases for health insurance plans. The warnings that our healthcare system is nearing the collapse point. These are big issues that are going to require serious, in-depth conversation and some measure of coming together. And hopefully there is a commitment on the part of our politicians. I certainly see a lot more of this in Vermont than I do nationally, say, where no matter where you come from ideologically, there is kind of a fundamental desire to solve our problems, which is often not the case with particularly the Republican side nationally. And so there is reason for hope, but the results of the primary at least seem to set up, my initial view of the November election with the sort of the centrist Democrats losing is that we are, I think, likely to see a return of supermajorities and 2 more years of what we've had the last 2, which has been dramatic. And the Democrats have done some significant things over Governor Scott's objections, but it doesn't help when there is so much conflict.
Right. And I think what I hear you say, John, is um, the place where things are breaking down, where we could perhaps be making more progress on finding solutions for some of these big issues, is when Scott's not showing up to the table to work with the legislature on these problems. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I mean, he insists that he's always ready to come to the table, but he never seems to be at the table. And I've heard for years, I've been hearing deep frustration on the part of Democratic leaders in the legislature about his refusal, reluctance, absence, and how, I mean, some of the veto controversies we've had are innate in policy differences, but a lot of them have been kind of nitpicky. And if the governor had, made his presence felt and raised certain points, in certain bills, a lot of conflict could have been avoided. And he just doesn't do that for whatever reason. And that is a pretty stark contrast to his predecessors as governor.
It's pretty, I mean, it's really extraordinary, the degree to which he does not come to the table to discuss.
Yeah. Yep. Emilie, what do you want to
yeah.
leave listeners with?
About the governor? I mean,
About
I think we
anything.
should talk about, well, since we're talking about, Governor Scott and the parties, let's spend a minute talking about the Democratic nominee for governor.
Sure.
Does that make sense? So Esther, who's the new Democratic nominee for governor, is coming on the show next week.
She is. Looking forward to it.
Stay tuned, I guess. Is that what people say?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's what we'll say.
Okay, great. And that's really exciting. She did not, and I think John's written about this a little bit, but she did not raise a ton of money this cycle. And it's not clear to me if she's going to be able to raise enough for the general in order to make a real impact. She's come down to Windham County a couple times, certainly. I will just say that both in the LG's race and the governor's primary, I don't think Windham County got anywhere near enough attention. And I feel bummed by that. I feel partially responsible because I did not, I was too focused on my own race to do a lot of inviting. But I'm hoping that before the general, we'll get a lot more attention from those statewide candidates. Because I think down here we have a lot to give to those conversations, and we turn out when someone shows up for us.
This is a good point. Yes. And I don't know about you, Emilie, but when it comes to campaigning, I am less interested in the mailers I see come through my mailbox or the ads I catch on the radio as I am about the conversations that you might hear on Vermont Public or when someone comes to town and they have an actual event. I don't know. Personally, I respond to those better.
Yeah, me too.
We have just a couple minutes before we need to go to break. Um, what are you sitting with right now, Emilie, having gone through your primary and now looking at the election and watching your friends go through their primaries or your peers, I
Yep.
should say?
I Lola DeFore from VPR came down for the day to hang out near our primary little circuit in Brattleboro. I told Ian and John, Ian and David that she was there for their race, but they didn't believe me. And in talking to her about it, I quoted you, Olga, which is that you never know when people are going to enter the conversation. And I, continue to think primaries are a really great access point, especially competitive primaries, for people to enter the conversation. And it's, striking to me as a legislator who I think, is definitely in like the top 5% of communication with my constituents of sitting state representatives. And there's just like a lot of people who aren't looped into all of the different channels I try to use. And that's really hard, and it matters. Like, it matters for people to know what's going on in this state. It matters, voting is one thing, but all the conversations that lead up to that and afterwards, I think, are even more important. And so I have sort of a renewed desire and a renewed confusion in how
How to reach people.
just like talk about all this stuff with people when no one has real much time to show up for anything,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the national scene takes up so much oxygen
Yes.
that
Yes.
people, to the extent they are engaged in politics, it's national politics. It's not state politics. And I say this as someone who has been writing about state politics for 12 years and obviously care about it. The vast majority of people just don't. Um, and I don't know exactly what we do about that. Democracy certainly works better when people are engaged and they have a sense of the issues and what's important and who their representatives are and how to reach them. But, we just had another primary with a dismally poor turnout, and kind of seems to be the way things are.
Mm-hmm. And on that very happy note, thank you, John. We're going to hear from some underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. And stay right there. We will be right back. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just joining us, I'm speaking with regular contributor, Representative Emilie Kornheiser from Brattleboro, as well as John Walters, the journalist behind the Vermont Political Observer. So glad you are both here today. I want to, before we dive into the conversation, thank BCTV for taking the video version of this show and sharing it with channels around Vermont. And Emilie, what do we remind listeners of?
Well, Olga, the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the hosts and the guests, respectively, not the station, nor platform, nor employers, nor friends, neighbors, pets.
Houseplants.
No one.
No one.
Houseplants. I was like gonna get into mycelium, and I decided I would sound like too much of a hippie, so
Kale, not their kale. Well, thank you both for being here. We've been talking about the primary And Emilie, you mentioned that you did some back of the envelope counting for voter turnout. And I know you're still going through those numbers, but what did you find? What's the early numbers telling you?
So I just looked at turnout for numbers in West Brattleboro, and I don't even have all the numbers I need to get like a full picture here. But and the other thing that was really interesting that I noticed a lot in this election is people kept on telling me, I'm a registered independent, I'm a registered Democrat, I'm a registered Republican. And I'm like, and I never knew what to say. I'm like, because it's not the kind of thing where it's useful to be like, that actually can't possibly be true, right? Because like it's people are just using it as a figure of speech on their path to actually say something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I sound like a distracted bad listener but like it was sort of this interesting phenomenon happening this time around too. And people do it on social media particularly a lot, but people were doing it in real life with me. And so we don't have party listeners who are not aware. We don't have party registration in Vermont. Every election, you get to pick whichever ballot you want to vote on. And frankly, in my primary, I was concerned that I was going to get a decent number of crossover voters who generally would vote Republican and decided to sort of jump onto the Democratic ticket, right? The same way we saw lots of Democrats jump on the Republican presidential primary ticket to vote for, I don't even remember her name.
Nikki Haley?
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Way
Sorry,
back
Nikki.
when.
And so I've just like looked at the numbers a little bit to try to figure that out, and I still don't know anything. But in Brattleboro, in West Brattleboro, in the Democratic primary in 2018, we had 816 folks. In 2020, we had 904 folks, but that was when primary ballots were mailed to every single house that year,
Right.
right? In 2022, it was just 762. We were not mailing anymore at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And then this year, it was 874. And so what I have not been able to pull up, because I ran out of minutes in this side project, is how many folks and this was like an unbelievably boring Republican primary year, really. And so I don't know if Republicans didn't turn out or if they pulled Democratic ballots. I don't know how many progressives who often vote in the progressive primary went over, would need to spend way more time. And I also don't know what that looks like statewide this year. But I think it's worth digging into all of that and figuring it out.
Mm-hmm.
And I did have a moment, actually, while I was already at the polls, being like, if I wanted to prevent crossover voting, I should have actually gotten John Rogers to come down here and campaign more often, so people would have been excited to vote for him. But I was not that forward thinking. You're all laughing. It would have been a good strategy.
Next time, squirrel that one away.
One of the great shibboleths of campaign observation is the crossover vote, where people are going to commit mayhem by voting in the other party's primary. It just doesn't happen. It happens to a small degree, but not to any greatly influential degree. You just, for whatever reason, Democrats don't think, hey, I can screw with the Republican Party, or Republicans likewise with the Democrats. It happens a little bit, but it doesn't happen nearly enough to sway any real competitive races.
Mm-hmm.
People just stay home. Stay home either literally, they don't vote, or they stay where they are comfortable ideologically. And people who would normally vote Democrat will vote in the Democratic primary, and that's one of the things behind this like wave of failures of centrist challengers to Democrats, is that it didn't turn out this mythical centrist vote. So it doesn't work. People talk about it every time, but it doesn't work.
Because along with lawn signs don't vote, one of the other great truisms, I don't have all the
Tropes.
words yet this week. I've really used tropes. I don't know if it's a trope because I think it actually, anyway, one of the other things that candidates say to each other is that it's like it's harder, it's so much harder to motivate a voter who doesn't usually vote to get out to vote than it is to do anything else, right? Like it's much easier to persuade an existing voter. But to get someone to vote who doesn't usually vote is a huge, huge ask. And I think similar crossover voting is close to that in terms of that
Mm-hmm.
said, like, you know, there's no doubt at all that that's what happened in Wyndham 1. And so it might be worth spending some minutes on that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, let's talk about Wyndham 1 for a moment. It's for those who don't know, Wyndham 1 is a district that covers the towns of Vernon and Guilford. And the two candidates that were running against each other in the primary were Zon Eastis and Jason Heron. And one thing worth noting, I think, about Jason, and he does talk about this on his campaign website, is he has run before, but he has run on the Republican ticket. And he decided this time to run on the Democratic ticket. And I have to say, this campaign got a little interesting. This race got a little interesting. I would say it got a little down and dirty at times. Wondering what your thoughts are, folks.
So I want to I someone shared something interesting about what they actually think his strategy is, which I think might have some real truth to it. And I want to put it out there again, saying this is not my idea.
Mhm.
But
And
you
when
know,
you say he, who do you mean?
Jason's
Okay.
strategy. So a few years ago, we knew that there was an explicit strategy among certain extremist Republicans, maybe even folks that don't even define themselves as Republicans, but just as extremists, to basically like bring down municipal government through public records requests. I don't know if you all remember that, but really doing these like very extreme asks of small towns in order to just basically like crash their systems and cause chaos, right? And that happened in some places in Vermont and a lot more in other places around the country. And in Guilford, Jason Heron has had a pretty sizable project of going after the select board there, and suing the town and just generally messing things up and causing taxpayers a lot of money and reducing trust in government, right? With his questions. And we know he's very clear that he's like one of the Convention of States people. And that is a national movement that he is a leader in, that's been trying to make inroads in Vermont. And I get emails about it fairly regularly. And that this entire running for office was less about getting elected and more actually testing strategies to cause some degree of future chaos or to even see how different things worked. And so there were a lot of questions about what was happening with the ballots, you know, the select board's relationship to the ballots. There was a letter sent out at the 11th hour that was sort of framed as if it was from the town of Guilford with some real allegations against Zon. And
Can I tweak what you just said, Emily,
yeah,
just in
please.
case someone
Yeah.
misunderstands it?
Yeah.
You said real allegations. They were allegations, but they
were
not real.
false allegations.
They were false
Thank you. Yes,
allegations.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Severe false allegations. By real, I meant severe. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
And so I
which is
guess
very
I'm,
dirty.
like, I think down here we've all been like, for the most part, just sort of writing him off as like our local extremist causing trouble in his own way from his own brain and imagination. But I wonder sort of how much this is like an organized testing. And then there's also sort of the backing of Belagore and the local media empire and what that all looks like that we can get into.
Well, John, you really followed Jason's first campaign pretty closely. And now that you have followed two of his campaigns, what are you sitting with? What have you seen based on, Emilie's question?
Well, he's an extremist and he's a troublemaker, and he is not at all a Democrat. Convention of States is this very radical project that's not unlike Project 2025, if you want a sort of a rough comp,
Yeah.
where they would call a convention a constitutional convention, but it would be limited to certain issues. It wouldn't be a wide open convention. It would basically be term limits and deficit spending and one or two other things, the conservative wish list. And, you know, he appeared on a Convention of States podcast. He is listed as the state coordinator for Vermont for this organization. Um, he appeared on a podcast that this group puts out last year, in which he talked about how they ran a candidate as a Republican in 2022 and she failed. She was a complete, utter disaster. And his conclusion from that was that voters just don't like Republicans in Vermont. Therefore, I'm going to run as a Democrat. And he just came right out and said it. And, you know,
He prettied it up on his website this round saying, oh, because politics are so divisive,
right,
I'm running as a Democrat in hopes of kind of easing out the divisiveness.
right, by accusing his opponent of nefarious misdeeds and ballot tampering and covering up sexual abuse at a nonprofit. That's how he's going to bring people together, I say.
And do we know for certain that it was his campaign that sent out that mail? I mean, that mailing and made those allegations?
No, because they're a little bit too clever for that. I don't know that he was behind it, but either he or his allies were behind it. And his only response has been to accuse his political opponents of trying to smear his name by associating him with these things, which isn't exactly taking the high road. And, you know, he has not, as far as I can tell, disavowed any of the allegations that were made. They were timed to, you know, land just before the primary and cause maximum damage. They didn't work. I think the truth is that, you know, Zon East is pretty popular in his community, whereas Jason Heron has made a royal pain of himself at select board meetings to the point where I think I'm not at all surprised that he lost by almost a 3-1 margin. And, you know, it's you can say, well, hooray, he lost, you know, a victory for democracy. But Emilie has a point that as long as these people are stomping all over the place and trying to cause trouble and trying to, you know, impede the actions of government, they have to be dealt with. You know, when you have people who are railing about DEI or, you know, transgender in schools or whatever the cause of the month is, that takes away a lot of time from actually solving the problems that we need to solve. And it takes away a lot of the energy from people who are well-intentioned and want to do well for their community, but don't want to put up with all this nonsense.
Yeah.
And so it does have a degrading effect on our not just politics, but on the way our society works.
Yeah. And I want to thank you, Emilie, for posing that question about strategy, because I think one thing we've gotten in the habit of doing as voters and as people who are watching politics is we tend to focus on one race at a time, right? Or maybe one person at a time. And when it comes to a lot of what's actually happening on the ground, there are a lot of long-term strategies like Project 2025 that also require a long-term view and a long-term action plan that need to be paid attention to, in my opinion. What would you like to add, Emilie?
I think this is all general theme that, like, I think people overly focus as just humans, I think it's a very human thing to do, but I think social media makes it worse and celebrity culture makes it worse in these moments of the single individual whose name is on the ticket, and less about that person's job truly being representation.
Mhm.
And that representation only works, I'm such a broken record about this, like when the community shows up and has that representative's back and holds that representative accountable, not just through the electoral process, but through conversations, right?
Mhm.
This just happens once every 2 years. And so I think when we make Jason Heron the standout weirdo, or Governor Scott the standout hero, we lose track that each of us are like, deeply, are just regular humans deeply entwined in our communities, and that we each have a real ability to impact whatever that individual happens to be thinking or doing when they're carrying out their job.
Mhm. Well, and I think we also lose track of a lot of what we need to solve also requires things like system changes
Mhm.
or pulling more levers at once or long-term implementation, which, if things are done correctly, will outlive the individual people who participated in the policy.
Mhm.
Um, I have to say, it really disturbs me about the mailer that was sent out to make it look like a municipal correspondence. And I'm just going to get off my soapbox for a minute. You know, one of the most important things about information control and helping people understand information is so they know where it's coming from. For example, in traditional newspapers, the sections are labeled. You got the news section, you've got the sports section, you have the arts section. So people kind of can frame um, the information they're about to consume. Same with, I mean, I have complaints about how movies are rated, but whether something has an R rating or a PG rating, it starts to tell you something about the movie. It gives you a framework before you even engage with it. And just how damaging it is to take a source that people are supposed to trust, like their town,
Mhm.
and mess with it. Just, ooh, gets me where I live. It just really gets me. So that's me hopping on my soapbox and saying, whoever thought that was a good idea, um, I don't know. I hope you, no, I won't finish the sentence. I hope karma has some words with you.
I think the Windham County Democrats have filed a complaint. I hope it goes somewhere. I hope there is an investigation. I don't know that it will produce a whole lot, but I think it's worth not letting this die quietly, even though Jason Heron's candidacy did, because it does have a corrosive effect, and it does hurt our community life.
We have just over 5 minutes.
Oh.
Um, Emilie, did you have a chance to say what you wanted to say about the lieutenant governor race?
I think it was sort of, it's a remarkable race, and I think the general election mashup will be particularly interesting for folks. Um, I think most popular wisdom was that like it would be really hard to unseat David Zuckerman, and Thomas Renner, at least down here, barely campaigned, raised very little money, and still had like a pretty sizable showing in the primary, given what seemed to me from down here to be a pretty significant lack of effort. Um, and I think that'll be really, and I think that Dave, so I don't know what that means for the future, but it means something. And maybe John has ideas about what it means for the future. And then I also think, like we talk constantly about like how like, farmers and folks who work the land don't have a big enough stake in Vermont politics. And we have two farmer types that are going to face off in the lieutenant governor's race, both who like derive a tremendous amount of their personal identity from the land. with very, very, very different vibes. But also two men who have known each other for a very long time, and served together for a very long time. So I think that'll be super fun for like make for quality TV, if not for quality politics.
Thanks, Emily. So going forward, looking ahead at the election, where do you feel we're going from here? What does this primary signal anything unique about the elections, or was it just one more step, no big deal? Kind of what are you both sitting with right now?
Well, I think to me, it's the old Sherlock Holmes line, the dog that did not bark in the nighttime.
Hmm.
We were looking at the primary to see if there would be an anti-tax movement, if there would be centrist sentiment, if there would be resentment against, Democratic lawmakers. There wasn't. It didn't happen. The dog didn't bark. And that leaves us with kind of like wondering if all this talk of anti-tax sentiment is really going to show itself in the election. I personally think it will not. The lieutenant governor's race will be the most high-profile test case for this, even though the office itself is meaningless, because John Rogers does represent that kind of like resentment against the new, the progressive, the unfamiliar, and the expensive. But to me, the biggest, whatever, and I said this earlier in the show, but whatever state factors play into this race, I think they're going to be just completely overwhelmed by the national, by the excitement in Democratic circles about the Harris-Walz ticket, the antipathy toward Donald Trump felt by the vast majority of Vermont voters, and the presence of Bernie Sanders on the ballot. This may be the last time he runs for office. A lot of people do like Bernie Sanders and like voting for him. I think those things are likely to be far more powerful than, rightly or wrongly, whatever you think about state issues, and we face some big issues. I don't think they're going to move the needle that much. And as I said earlier, I think we're set up for a strong Democratic showing in November, aside
Emily.
from Phil Scott.
Thank you, John. Sorry, Emily.
I agree with John. I think, everything about November is going to be the national election. And that's the conversation that we'll be having. And that's great and unbelievably important. And I'm hoping that folks can keep on riding the involvement and the hope and the vibe shift that we are all experiencing right now. I also think we could spend a whole next show soon, and maybe after Esther,
Okay.
talking about so VT Digger did basically like a questionnaire of every candidate.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people who didn't fill it out, but a lot of people did. And I was quite struck by how consistent some of the answers were. For instance, they asked for the first time about folks thought that, the wealthiest should pay more in taxes. And even those folks that we've described as centrist Democrats, both Stuart and Amanda said yes. And so what does that mean for the future of taxation in Vermont? I don't know, but we will soon find out.
All right. Yeah, I like that suggestion. Especially since, Digger has been holding these or sending out these questionnaires for a while. It would be good to kind of look into them and see what's there this time around. Well, Emilie Kornheiser, if people want to reach out to you, how can they do that?
Folks can go to my website, emiliekornheiser.org, and you'll find email address and phone numbers and ways to sign up to receive my very detailed and somewhat geeky newsletter. And I'll be here every week talking with you, Olga. Folks can tune in then.
Yay! And John, if people want to read more of your work, how can they do that?
First, I'll just say that geeky is one of the prime characteristics you want in, like, the chair of a tax writing committee.
Thanks, John.
Yes.
I am, my blog is the Vermont Political Observer, thevpo.org. If you check me out on, if you're still on Elon's hellscape, I'm still there. And at the VPO 1, the number 1. I'm easy to find. Let's put it that way.
Fantastic. And of course, you can always drop the Montpelier Happy Hour an email at the montpelierhappyhour@gmail.com. We are here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro every Friday at 2, rebroadcasted on Wednesday morning, and wherever you subscribe to your podcast. Have a great weekend, everyone, and take care.